Hello, this is Ron Climer with First Real Estate School in Hendersonville, North Carolina, and this is number 4 of the reading of the comments from the North Carolina Real Estate Commission. Now, I discovered something while I was taking my break, and I'm on page 624 in this book. However, if you look on page 624, that's the book number for the book. But if you look down at the bottom of the page, there's page numbers for the comments. So this is page 10 for the comments. And the comments, if you haven't been with me for the first 3, you should go back and start with number 1. But the comments are comments about the North Carolina Real Estate License Law. And this is available as a free download from the North Carolina Real Estate Commission at www.ncrec.gov. So if you don't have this, you for sure need it, because this is about at least half of the material that's on the state portion, the 40 question state portion of the North Carolina real estate exam, the one with the 51% pass rate last month. By the way, one of the reasons I'm doing this is to help increase that pass rate. But join me on page 10, General Brokerage Provisions. It says, discuss below are selected commission rules related to general brokerage. The first one is Agency Agreements and Disclosure, GS 93. Provided below is a brief summary of the various provisions of the commission rules regarding agency agreements and disclosure. For a much more in-depth discussion of this rule and its application, you're referred to the Commission North Carolina Real Estate Manual. Agency Agreements, GS 93, requires all agency agreements for brokerage services in both sales and lease transactions to be in writing and signed by the parties thereto. Paragraph A requires agency agreements with property owners, both sellers and lessors, of any type of property to be in writing prior to the brokerage providing any services. Allows an express oral buyer-tenant agency agreement from the outset of a relationship, but this agreement must be reduced to writing no later than the time any party to the transaction wants to extend an offer. As a practical matter, this oral agreement needs to address all key aspects of the relationship, including agency compensation, authorization for dual agency, etc. Note, a buyer-tenant agency agreement must be in writing from the outset if it seeks to limit the buyer-tenant's right to work with other agents or binds the client to the agent for any definite time period. In other words, an oral buyer-tenant agency agreement must be non-exclusive and must be for an indefinite period and terminated by the client at any time. Further, every written agreement of any kind must also provide for its existence for a definite period of time and to terminate without prior notice at the expiration of that period. Exceptions and an agency agreement between a broker and a landlord to procure tenants for the landlord's property may allow for the automatic renewal so long as the landlord may terminate with notice at the end of any contract or renewal period. Contain the rule non-discrimination, fair housing provision, namely, the broker shall conduct all brokerage activities in regard to this agreement without respect to race, color, religion, sex, national origin, handicap, or familial status of any party or prospective party. This provision must be set forth in a clear and conspicuous manner which shall distinguish it from other provisions of the agency agreement. Include the license number of the individual licensee who signs the agreement. Allowing an agent to work with the buyer under an express oral buyer agency agreement is intended to address problems of buyers being reluctant to sign a written buyer agency agreement at the outset of their relationship with the buyer agent. The idea underlying this approach is to allow an agent to work temporarily with a prospective buyer as the buyer's agent under an oral agreement while the agent establishes a rapport with the buyer that makes the buyer feel more comfortable with signing a written buyer agency agreement. Although the rule allows oral buyer agency agreements until the point in time when the party is ready to make an offer, it is nevertheless highly advisable that agents have such agreements reduced to writing and signed by the buyer at the earliest possible time in order to avoid misunderstanding and conflict between the buyer and the agent. Recall also that the agent must obtain a written buyer-tenant agency agreement from a client no later than the time either party to the transaction extends an offer to the other. If a buyer will not sign a written buyer agency agreement prior to making or receiving an offer, then the agent may not continue to work with that buyer as a buyer's agent. Moreover, the agent may not begin at this point to work with the buyer as a seller's subagent unless the agent fully advises the buyer of the consequences of agency switching from buyer agent to seller's agent, including the fact that the agent would have to disclose to the seller any information, including confidential information about the buyer that might influence the seller's decision in this transaction. 2, obtains the buyer's consent. And 3, obtains the consent of the seller and listing firm, which is the seller's agent. The foregoing applies equally to brokers working with tenants as a tenant agent. Agency disclosure requirements. While Rule A0104A requires all agency agreements, whether for lease or sales transactions, to be in writing, the rule disclosure requirement applies only to sales transactions. It requires licensee to provide prospective buyers and sellers at first substantial contact with a copy of the Working with Real Estate Agents brochure, to review the brochure with them and then reach an agreement regarding their agency relationship. The licensee providing the brochure should also include his or her name and the license number of the brochure on the brochure. Note that the obligation under this rule is not satisfied merely by handing the prospective seller or buyer the brochure to read. The agent is required to review the contents of the brochure with the buyer or seller and then reach agreement with the prospective buyer or seller as to whether the agent will work with the buyer or seller as their agent or an agent of the other party. In the case of a prospective seller, the agent may either act as the seller's agent, which is the typical situation, and requires a written agreement from the outset of their relationship, or 2, work with the seller as a buyer's agent if the agent already represents a prospective buyer. In the case of a prospective buyer, the agent may either 1, act as the buyer's agent under either an oral or written agreement, as addressed in Rule A104, or work with the buyer as a seller's agent, disclosure of which must be in writing from the outset. Disclosure of agency status by sellers, agents, and subagents to prospective buyers. Paragraph E of the Rule A104, like paragraph C, requires a seller's agent or subagent in sales transactions to disclose their agency status in writing to a prospective buyer at first substantial contact with the buyer. It's recommended that sellers' agents make this required written disclosure using the form provided for this purpose in the Working with Real Estate Agents brochure that must be provided to buyers as well as to sellers at first substantial contact. This form has a place for the buyer to acknowledge receipt of the brochure and disclosure of agency status, thereby providing the agent with written evidence of having provided the brochure and disclosure. The disclosure may, however, be made using a different form. The most important point is that the disclosure be made in writing in a timely manner. The reason for this requirement is that buyers tend to assume that the agent they contact to work with them in locating a property for purchase is their agent and working primarily in their interest. This may or may not be the case in reality. So the purpose of the disclosure requirement is to place prospective buyers on notice that the agent they are dealing with is not their agent before the prospective buyer discloses information which the buyer would not want a seller to know because it might compromise their bargaining position. Most frequently, first substantial contact will occur at the first face-to-face meeting with a prospective buyer. However, the point in time that first substantial contact with a prospective buyer occurs will vary depending on the particular situation and may or may not be at the time of the first or initial contact with the prospective buyer. Many first contacts are by telephone and do not involve discussions which reach the level that would require disclosure, although some initial phone contacts, especially those with out-of-town buyers, could reach this level. First substantial contact occurs at the point in time when a discussion with a prospective buyer begins to focus on the buyer's specific property needs and desires or the buyer's financial situation. Typically, that point in time is reached when the agent is ready to solicit information from the prospective buyer that's needed to identify prospective properties to show the buyer. Therefore, an agent planning to work with a prospective buyer or seller's agent or sub-agent should assure that disclosure of his or her agency status is made in writing to the prospective buyer prior to obtaining from the prospective buyer any personal or confidential information that the buyer would not want the seller to know. A few examples of such personal or confidential information include the maximum price a buyer is willing to pay for a property, the buyer's ability to pay more than the price offered by the buyer, or the fact that the buyer has a special interest in purchasing the seller's property rather than some similar property. In any event, the disclosure must be made prior to discussing with the prospective buyer his or her specific needs or desires regarding the purchase of a property. As a practical matter, this means the disclosure will always need to be made prior to showing a property to a prospective buyer. The best policy is to simply make the disclosure In any event, the disclosure must be made prior to discussing with the prospective buyer his specifications, needs, or desires regarding the purchase of a property. As a practical matter, this means the disclosure will always need to be made prior to showing a property to a prospective buyer. The best policy is simply make the disclosure at the earliest possible time. If first substantial contact occurs by telephone or by means of other electronic communication where it is not practical to provide written disclosure, the agent should immediately disclose by similar means who he represents and shall immediately, but in no event later than 3 days from the date of the first substantial contact, mail or otherwise transmit a copy of the written disclosure to the buyer. Disclosure of agency status by buyer's agents to sellers or seller's agents. Paragraph F of Rule A-104 requires a buyer's agent to disclose his agency status to a seller or seller's agent at the initial contact with the seller or seller's agent. Initial contact will typically occur when a buyer's agent telephones or otherwise contacts the listing firm to schedule a showing. The initial disclosure may be oral, but a written confirmation of the previous oral disclosure must be made, except in auction sale transactions, no later than the time of delivery of an offer to purchase. The written confirmation may be, and usually is, included in the offer to purchase. In fact, Commission Rule 10112 requires that any pre-printed offer to purchase and contact form used by an agent include a provision providing for confirmation of agency status by each real estate agent and firm involved in the transaction. Consent to dual agency. Paragraph D of Rule A-104 requires generally that an agent must obtain the written authority of all parties prior to undertaking to represent those parties as a dual agent. It's important to note that this requirement applies to all real estate transactions, sales and rentals, not just sales transactions. In sales transactions, this written authority to act as a dual agent is usually limited to in-house sales transactions and usually included in the listing and buyer agency contract. If those contracts do not grant such authority, then the agent must have both the seller and the buyer consent to the dual agency prior to beginning an act of dual agency for both parties. Paragraph D of Rule A104 currently requires written authority for dual agency from the formation of the relationship, except situations where a buyer is represented by an agent working under an oral buyer agency agreement, as permitted by Rule 104, in which case written authority for dual agency must be obtained no later than the time the parties represented by the agency working as a dual agent makes an offer to purchase, sell, rent, lease, or exchange real estate to the other party. Thus, it is permissible for the agent to operate as a limited period of time under an oral dual agency agreement. It is very important to remember that GS 93 still requires agents to obtain the consent of all parties prior to beginning to act as a dual agent for those parties. Therefore, it is essential that agents electing to operate as a dual agent for a limited period of time without obtaining this authority in writing still explain fully the consequences of their acting as a dual agent and obtain the parties' oral consent. As a practical matter in sales transactions, agents will frequently have obtained written authority to act as a dual agent for in-house sales transactions at the time the initial written listing or buyer agency agreement is executed. However, under paragraph A of Rule 104, many buyer agents elect to work with their buyer clients for a period of time under an oral buyer agency agreement. Paragraph D permits such buyer agents to also operate for a limited period of time as dual agents under an oral agreement in order to deal with situations where a buyer client is interested in a property listed with the agent's firm. Note that although an oral dual agency agreement for a limited period of time is permitted by commission rules, it is strongly recommended that agents have a dual agency agreement in writing from the outset of a dual agency arrangement. This will provide the agent with some evidence that the matter of dual agency was discussed with the parties and that they consented to it. Such evidence would prove quite useful if the party later asserts that the agent did not obtain their consent for dual agency in a timely manner. Auction sales exemption. Paragraph G of Rule 104 provides that the provisions of paragraphs C, D, and E of the rule shall not apply to real estate licensees representing sellers in auction sales transactions. Note that in auction sales, the real estate agent involved almost invariably work only as seller's agent, and that fact is considered to be self-evident. Thus, there is no need for agents to distribute and review the Working with Real Estate Agents brochure, no need for disclosure of agency status by the seller's agent, and no dual agency for the unusual situation where a buyer may be represented by an agent in an auction sale transaction. Paragraph H of Rule A104 provides that such a buyer's agent shall no later than the time of execution of a written agreement memorializing the buyer's contract to purchase provide the seller or seller's agents with a written confirmation that he represents the buyer. Dual agency status of the firm. Paragraph I of Rule 104 codifies the Commission's rules and common law rules that a firm which represents more than one party in the same real estate sales transaction is a dual agent, and further states that the firm, through the brokers affiliated with the firm, shall disclose dual agency to the parties. This rule provision does not establish any additional requirements for licensees and is intended merely to clarify that the Commission follows the common law rule. In other words, dual agency is not limited to those situations where an individual is working with both a buyer client and a seller client, or lessor and commercial tenant, in the same transaction. If one agent of a firm is working with the buyer client of the firm, and another agent of the same firm is working with the seller client of the firm in a transaction involving the sale of the seller's client's property to the buyer client, then the firm is a dual agent as it holds both agency agreements. However, a firm functions through its employees, namely as associated agents. However, a firm functions through its employees, namely its associated agents. Thus, under common law, whenever the firm is a dual agent of certain parties in a transaction, all licensees affiliated with that firm are also dual agents of those parties in that transaction. Wow. Hold on a second. Designated agency. Paragraphs J and M of Rule 104 authorize real estate firms to engage in a form of dual agency practice referred to in the rules as designated agency. In certain sales transactions involving in-house dual agency, designated agency is an optional method of practicing dual agency that may be adopted by a real estate firm if the firm establishes a policy consistent with the Commission's designated agency rules. Designated agency involves appointment of a designating an individual agent in a firm to represent only the interest of the seller and another individual agent to represent only the interest of the buyer, where a firm has an in-house dual agency situation. The principal advantage of the designated agency approach over the standard dual agency approach is that each of a firm's clients, seller and buyer, receive fuller representation by their designated agent. In a typical dual agency situation, client advocacy is essentially lost because the dual agent may not seek an advantage for, advocate for, one client to the detriment of the other client. The dual agent must remain completely neutral and impartial at all times. Designated agency returns advocacy to the services provided by the respective designated agents and allows them to more fully represent their respective clients. Authority to practice designated agency must be in writing no later than the time a written dual agency agreement is required under A104. Additional required procedures for practicing designated agency are clearly spelled out in paragraph J through M and are not discussed further here. For more detailed coverage of dual and designated agency, the reader is once again referred to the Commission's North Carolina Real Estate Manual. Dual agency by individual agent. Paragraph N of Rule 104 authorizes individual agents representing both the buyer and the seller in the same transaction pursuant to a dual agency agreement to include in the agreement a provision authorizing the agent not to disclose certain confidential information about one party to the other party without permission from the party about whom the information pertains. This provision is intended to allow individual dual agents to treat confidential information about their clients in a manner similar to that allowed for firms practicing designated agency. I'm going to stop and take a break right there, but before I do, let me remind you, if what we're doing has done you any good, please make a comment and say, Ron, this has done me some good. If it's done you a lot of good, make a comment, click like. But also, I wanted to tell you about a thing I have that I have a website, www.ncreexam.com, And if you, after we finish this, if you feel like, man, I got this stuff, I'm ready to go take the $164 exam. Well, before you do, go to this website and take my $10 exam and see how you do. Because this is a lot of what's on the state portion of the exam, but it's not all of it. So that's www.ncreexam.com. Check that out before you go spend your $164. This is number 4. We're going to come back in a few minutes with number 5.